the day after talk. There's no pressure there. I want to tell you actually that probably like almost everyone in this room, I was up late and I got up early, and I also forgot to leave the car seats with my husband up in Fayetteville, and there were a series of fiascos this morning. I left my computer power pack, etc. So anyway, I just threw on not just jeans, but kind of dirty jeans this morning. And I went down to get a cup of coffee and used the business center at the Peabody. And I kind of look around and I finally find a little place, and I get in line, and there are 3 people in front of me, and of course one of them is John Bozeman. Alrighty. So, in any case, of course he was gracious, as he always is, and it was just one of those, I think probably 2 lessons there. One is, if you're at the Peabody, just put on a suit. The other one is, Arkansas politicians, whatever their stripe, you're always close to them. They're never more than a step or 2 removed from you, which I love. And they're always gracious, so I was grateful for that, and it was a fun experience. It was nice to be able to congratulate him. And he also seemed not busy, which I thought was hilarious, that very low-key, "Hey, Janine, how you doing?" It was great. In any case, I'm really delighted to visit with you. I have in here in this lovely setting, because I've seen pictures of a glorious fall foliage. But I really admire that you all came out in such a rainy day and to talk about this. And I really like to talk about this subject. I've been doing it for some time. I did a lot of thinking over the last couple of weeks, and certainly last night and this morning, about this message, and I have had to alter it somewhat. I feel like I've been sort of swimming upstream and in a defensible way on evaluating the rising Republican hypothesis. I'm not sure that's true any longer. So this is something that I'm thinking about, and I bet y'all are too. I will say that when I arrived here as the new sort of state politics person in the 1990s, there was little topic more vigorously debated in political circles than whether, or usually when, right? When the Republicans would slay the big D Democratic giant in Arkansas. And, of course, it's cycling back. And still, I would posit that it's a matter about which much is said, but little is known. And that's what I thought we could talk about today in a little bit more detail. It might be more accurate and probably, well, inevitably, certainly nicer to suggest that the question is rarely considered as carefully as it ought to be. And that's a theme that I want you to see. That is by collecting all manner of evidence and then evaluating it, I think, to arrive at a better informed and reasoned answer, and one that can last beyond the current election cycle, right? What does it mean? What do we know, etc. So can we do that in 30 minutes or 25 minutes? So what I propose that we do is actually start in a rather peculiar place, and it's with an old and perhaps for a lot of you vaguely familiar story, really, I guess an allegory of all things about an elephant. How many of you have heard or been exposed to that allegory about the blind man and the elephant? Right? A little bit, and so we know this a little bit. So basically, right, what happens is you start out, right, this is the old John Godfrey Sachs, and it apparently dates back to like the 14 or 1500s. But here's his version of it, right, the beginning. It was six men of Hindustan to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. So, of course, then what happens is one of them touches the elephant's side, and concludes that it's a wall. Another touches the tusk and concludes that the elephant is a spear, right? Still another, a trunk, and that's a snake. The knee is the tree. Thank you. That wasn't awkward at all. Well done. The ear is a fan, the tail is a rope, etc. And then we sort of get to this place. And so these men of Hindustan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion, exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right and all were in the wrong, in terms of the conclusion, of course, the conclusions that they drew. So it's a clever little bit of wisdom that's been with us for a very long time, and I think it speaks in part to what academic types would call looking for the truth at the confluence of many streams of evidence. That's what I hope we can do today. In short, we are advised to look not just at 1 or 2 or 3 individual pieces of a puzzle, 1 or 2 or 3 election winners, 1 or 2 or 3 election cycles, right? But rather to gather up all the pieces, sort them, understand them in relation to each other, and then step back and try to draw some more meaningful conclusions about the big picture. So that's what we want to do today. So what about the body of evidence? Let's gather up the pieces by asking several questions about the relative health of the Republican and Democratic parties historically, mainly, and then adding in today as we can. So let's start with this question. One way to evaluate the health of a political party, right, is to look at the number of identifiers, the proportion of identifiers, right? People who say they are Republican, who say they are Democrat, or who say that they insist that they are neither. And that's certainly, that's probably one of the simplest ways, I think, to keep score. And it's something we've been keeping score on for a long time. So certainly we know that before the 1990s, right, things looked pretty dismal for the Republican Party in Arkansas, and that's not that long ago. For the past 11 years that we've been polling on the Arkansas poll, this question, do you generally speaking consider yourself a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, or what? They've held steady, right? Republicans have held steady at about a quarter. They'll go down to 22 or 23%. They'll pop up to 28%, right around there. And then the Democrats and the independents will split the rest. So 11 years, this has been steady as she goes every time. Interestingly, they shrunk to only a fifth this year. So we saw Republicans' lowest measure. We also saw Democrats' lowest measure in terms of what people say they are. Now, what they do, right, it can be quite a different thing. So that was interesting. What we saw take off, of course, were the independent identifiers, and I don't know exactly how you want to, they're not really identifiers, right, but the people who refuse to identify. And they really took off this year. It was a record high with the independent identifiers this year. In addition to that, right, what can we say about the independents? Well, without fail, until this year, we would ask the independents, really, seriously, you can tell me, right? Are you closer to the Democratic Party, closer to the Republican Party, or truly in the middle? And almost without fail, there's a little roughness there, but it was a third, and a third, right? There was just tremendous stability over time. This year was an aberration. And I'm telling you something, right, that you all know. It was very much an aberration for us, so we could see something coming. I'm not sure we saw that it was as big as it looks like it may be. But we saw not only those independents take off, but among the independents, they swung really hard to the right in a way that we hadn't seen before. Specifically, some of you might have seen in the Arkansas poll results that among the very likely voters, the self-reported very likely voters, fully 50% of those independents, which are, again, a huge part of the Arkansas electorate, that fully 50% of them said that they were closer to the Republican Party. We've never seen anything like that. That's a really big swing. Whether or not it's sustained, right, that's the question of the hour. There are actually a couple of other ways, of course, to measure partisanship, many other ways, to measure this idea of generalized support for Democrats and Republicans in the electorate. You could look at the percentage of the electorate casting their ballots for Democratic nominees. And this is probably a little bit difficult to see from back there, but basically I've taken the presidential race, the gubernatorial race, and U.S. Senate races, and kind of tried to watch those go over time, and you see a lot of bouncing around. You could also, of course, look at primary election turnout, and we don't have time really to go into this today, but many of you know that 2008 was really significant because we separated, right, and we had a presidential-only primary, and therefore created a mailing list for the Republican Party of Arkansas that I think was probably very valuable. We have this big bump in 2008, which was a really interesting measure for people who are interested in the scholarship. So, of course, asking people about their party preference, right? What do you say you are? That isn't a complete way, right? Not nearly to assess a party's health. Just as examining the trunk of an elephant isn't the way to understand. It isn't a way to know the elephant. So to really evaluate the strength of the Republican Party in Arkansas over time, we need to examine, I think, several other measures. Specifically their ability to field, and this has been huge for Republicans, as many of you in this room know, to field candidates, and then, of course, to get the candidates they field elected. So we're interested in their success in turning in candidates. We're interested in their success in those candidates' success in turning out voters in statewide office, and then, of course, in all those regional offices, since so many of our positions, right, are regional or district type in nature. So if we consider the Republicans' ability to field and elect candidates to office, if we feel that part of the elephant, right, I think we get somewhat mixed results, right? And this year, right, is certainly moving in one direction, past years moving in another direction. On the one hand, and just a few data points here, there's so much you could look at. There is indeed the fact that the state's electoral college votes, right, have gone to the Republican nominee more often than not in recent cycles. In 2000, it might be hard to remember this, right? But we were actually a close contest, right? One of those battleground states, and there was a 5-point gap in the end, right, for George W. Bush. It expanded to 9 points in 2004, and then, of course, it took off in 2008, a 20-point gap for the Republican nominee that year. So point Republicans in our evaluative scheme here for sure. It's also a case that until 2006, Republicans occupied the governor's and the lieutenant governor's posts for 10 years. That's no mean feat. In addition, of course, as of last night, Arkansas Republicans have now managed to elect, right, 2 U.S. senators, the first in 1996, the second now U.S. Senate-elect, John Bozeman. And of course, in 1996, we were among the last southern states to do that since Reconstruction. And then, of course, you can look at those U.S. House seats, right? At least until last night, the first, right, was the only one that hadn't been occupied by a Republican for some length of time, and now, even the first has flipped. Republicans also, of course, have increased their state house representation many-fold since the 1960s. They moved, of course, from consistently holding less than 5%, really pitiful, less than 5% of the 135 seats 40 years ago, rarely more than 10% of the seats during most of Bill Clinton's duration, which isn't all that long ago, his tenure as governor, up to 30%, back down to about 25%, and now way up, right, which is an interesting development. And I would point out that we've had one other sort of jump period that a lot of people, that became the one, and I think that's the big question here, right? Is this election the one? I can tell you from a review of LexisNexis articles over the last 20 years that there have been many elections, right, that have been the one over time. I think this one shows a lot stronger potential for actually fitting that bill. But I'd like to see a few more election cycles to come, as would many of you, to determine that. But remember that between 1996 and 2000, some of you may know that the Republican numbers basically doubled, right, in just right there. And of course, what was happening? Why were the Republican numbers in the state legislature moving so quickly? Yeah, thank you, Jay. Turbulence. Exactly. And of course, finally, thanks to Asa Hutchinson, primary elections, right, were being state funded. We'd had some high-profile Republican candidacies and wins. So there's sort of this trifecta of finally Republicans would surge, right, in the mid-1990s. This is why this was the narrative here in the mid-1990s. But then, of course, the candidacy slipped. We'll talk about that in a second. The win slipped, right, and the whole thing sort of seemed to settle back down, which is interesting. Maybe that was temporary. We'll see. So I did want to show you, this is a huge roundup, and I think they've already posted this online, so you're welcome to look at it. But this is just a lot of those data points. So looking at levels of government, looking at branches of government. I feel like I'm giving you some kind of dispensation. But in any case, this is something you can sort of track things over time. Many parts of the elephant, but not all of them, represented here. So there are some other things I think that you could look at, and until this election cycle, and even then I think it could have been stronger even than it has been, so I'm looking forward to 2012 in an empirical way. The Republicans have had less success, right, until this year in looking at in dealing with their serious and prolonged stagnation in fielding candidates, and I just sort of suggested this. So specifically in recent election cycles, Republicans have repeatedly filed to run, just as a general rule, in fewer, sometimes far fewer, than half of the state House and Senate seats. And as the old Washington State Lottery used to be, you can't win if you don't play. And this has just been a huge problem, right? This lack of a bench and this lack of even sort of getting warm bodies in the race, right? Because you're not going to win no matter what the electorate is doing unless there's a candidate in the race. So that's been a source of frustration, I know, for people who favor Republicans and or favor two-party competition in the state. And indeed, some of you may not remember this, right? We tend to work just one election cycle at a time. But you might recall that in 2008, I'm sure Clinton will, that Republicans only contested, 13 of 75 of the House seats that were held by Democrats that year. None of the state Senate, right, that were that year. And so we just didn't have a lot of party competition. And I think everybody was looking around going, what's happening? Is the Republican Party going to rise again, or is it not? It was also in 1998, 2008, and not that long ago, that the Republicans, didn't file in most of the U.S. House seats. right? And here we are in such a different place, which is really, really interesting. And I think the AP actually ran a story like this, which I thought was great, that not since 1954 had there not, until 2008, had there not been a single contest between the major political parties for at least one of the districts. And so that really seemed like, wow, something's not happening here that we thought should be happening here, or that we had been promised, right, the 15 years before. Certainly you could look at statewide executive office filings. Remember that in 2006 there was a bit of a, kind of a cruel chuckle perhaps that, the Green Party fielded more candidates for statewide constitutional offices than the Republicans did. And so, they had a little bit of an uptick this time. I know from talking to some that they wish they'd gone ahead and maybe run some candidates in some other races. But the whole point, I think, is that there's been something of a shallow bench, and most of you know this, a shallow bench in terms of Arkansas Republican politics for a long time, not being able to hang on to that. And that's not even moving down ticket, to those to those prosecuting attorney races, to the county JPs, the places where many people grow careers. And so that's the kind of thing that I want to be watching from here on out. That's often the pipeline for people to get experience and name recognition and financial support and all the things that they need. In fact, arguably until this year, how many of you remember, I didn't have permission to use it, so I didn't bring it, but there's a wonderful old George Fisher cartoon where there's an elephant standing and it says, how to build an elephant house. Does anybody remember this? And he's standing there, the elephant. He's got his big tool belt. He looks very masculine, like he means business. And he's holding up the trusses, but he's looking around, right? And all that's at the foundation, right, are the little strings with a little chalk mark. No foundation, right? How to build an elephant house. So in that year, of course, this was 1980. So Frank White is the roof, right? But there's nothing on which to set the roof. And so that has really been, I think, holding back two-party competition in Arkansas for such a long time. We can say a little bit more. What about the willingness of Republican and Democratic voters, especially in certain counties, to turn out for the candidates the GOP produces? If we look at this part of the elephant, I think things look really promising for Republican prospects, and they did even before this election cycle. Specifically, and there's a really dense thing I want to show you here in just a minute, so I'll try to introduce it and then I'll flash it up there. And again, you can download it from their website, I think, from the Clinton School website. If you consider the major population centers in Arkansas, which really, of course, drive Arkansas elections, it tends to be the counties in the northwest corner. Benton County, Washington County, Sebastian County, that produce the greatest turnout rates, right, in the state. The counties in central and southeast, right, often see turnout rates, 15, 20 points below the turnout rates in the northwest. If you compound that greater than average propensity to turn out in the northwest counties, together with their increasing Republican fervor, or with their tremendous Republican fervor relative, again, to central and southeastern Arkansas, you get those other areas are finding it very difficult to keep up. And so in this way, Republicans, again, even before this election cycle, have been showing tremendous strength. In 2008, for example, the votes again were concentrated, as in years past, in the 10 largest counties. The 10 largest counties out of 75 in Arkansas constitute right about half of the state's population. Huge portion, of course, of the voting population then as well. And again, if what you look at here, and this is kind of hard to visualize, but basically it's something that Jay and I created for a chapter in a book, and Todd Shields, where you're looking at the 2008 vote relative to the 2004 vote. You're looking at voter turnout, and then you're looking at the intensity of the vote, right? The vote preference in those final columns. Anytime it's in parentheses, right, where I'm comparing 2008 to 2004. And I know that there's a lot going on here. But basically, we think what you see is those relatively affluent suburban counties of Benton and Saline, for example, not only beat the statewide turnout average, by several percentage points, but they also, of course, deliver these lopsided margins for Republican candidates. Long-suffering Jefferson County, which is about to fall off this list. I think we've been doing this table for 3 election cycles now, and Jefferson County, right, just keeps falling down and is about to fall off that list of the top 10 most populous counties. Well, they throw their support to the Democrat overwhelmingly, right? But because their turnout rate is so low compared to these other places, they simply can't keep up. And so we've got, right, a really significant numbers game as well as a preference game going on here. And I had a friend point out to me on email this morning that, again, if you look at Beebe's win, in addition to all those other wins statewide this year, Northwest Arkansas, right, the numbers are just absolutely enormous. It's really hard to be a candidate, not have some relationship with Northwest Arkansas, Democrat or Republican, because of the numbers and the propensity to turn out up there. So certainly there are lots of bits of evidence that we could examine, but just working with what we've got, what can we say about the rising Republican hypothesis that was so much in vogue 15 to 20 years ago? It certainly has returned in great force, not just in Arkansas, but nationwide. That's the prevailing narrative, certainly this year. Did anyone see, I was reading, this is an aside, I was reading stateline.org this morning, and they said that this is, the first year since Reconstruction that the majority of state legislative chambers in the South will be Republican. And they also talked about gubernatorial races, and there were just a number of really interesting factoids on the state level, which again are those pipelines to the national level. So read stateline.org if you want to know what's going to happen in 4 to 8 years. That's my shout out to my favorite news source. In any case, what can we say? How far off are we, right? This one election cycle indeed being significant, indeed offering not just a single star, but lots of points that are suggestive of a competitive two-party system. But how far are we overall from Jim Rankino's 1977 assertion that Republicans win the state only by luck, disease, or when the Democrats make fools of themselves, right? In 2006, we didn't seem to be very far at all from that. And in 2008, right, barring the big Republican blowout at the presidential race, right, which you could say, well, really, is it a reflection of Arkansas, is it not? We didn't seem very far from that. Today, right, we seem very far from that. And we might, what I'm suggesting, want to be careful about making too much of those single election cycles, because where we are now could be a very different place from where we are in 2 years. This is something we learn each time. So the answer, right, about the rising Republican hypothesis is that it depends. It depends on what you're examining and for how long you're examining it, what level across what branch of government. Republicans do make up a respectable portion of the electorate, right? Either Republicans or independents who, at least this year, are leaning heavily Republican. They tend to have more money. We know this from the Arkansas poll as well as other measures. And they tend to turn out to vote more dependably. That's huge. They also, Jay worked this out a while ago, because we asked a question on the Arkansas poll about how long have you lived here, and it's really just supposed to be a warm-up question, but it turns out it's a fantastic data source. Because what we find, of course, is that party identification among people who've lived here 10 years or less is basically reverse, right, of what it is for the state overall. So there's that whole thesis about migrating, right, in migration by Republicans. I mean, the people have been talking about for 40 years. But still, right, Republicans, at least by asking what they are, and again, looking even at this year, are significantly and consistently fewer in number in terms of identifiers than either Democrats or independents. And that's with that first screen. Republicans are certainly making a strong showing in the high-profile races for president, for governor, and now we have another U.S. Senate race. And so, we've long had this top-of-the-ticket Republicanism, which seemed to even fade in 2006, but now, right, may be back again. But the candidacies, right, in the late 1990s and through the 2000s for those lower-level offices and even for those U.S. House seats that I mentioned right in 2008, the candidacies fell flat for quite a long period of time. They even declined for a time. And it's hard to compete, as I said before, if you're fielding less than half the number of players than your opponent. So certainly the influence of Arkansas Republicans is growing, but I think we always have to ask relative to what, right? Relative to their virtual absence historically, even in Bill Clinton's day, not that long ago really, they were an anomaly, that's true. So certainly by that measure, dramatic change. No way of getting around that, right? Relative to Democrats, this year, yes. Last year and the cycle before, no. We need to look at it, right, in a sustained sort of way, and I think that we can examine many parts of this complicated puzzle. For as the old parable, right, warns us, the conclusion you draw about an unfamiliar object. And in Arkansas's political history, Republicans have been an unfamiliar object, right? Vaguely threatening, sort of cute, right? What do we do with it? Sort of swinging around. So there it is. Whether it's an elephant or the Arkansas Republican Party. You like that, Susanna? It depends. Yes, you're sweet. It depends on what you're looking at, what you're measuring, for how long you're measuring it, right? This is the kind of message. So this crowd, I think, welcome your questions and observations, because there's so much to talk about.
Thank you.